So now that we've talked about everything that needs to be addressed here in Volume 2 of the Technical Director Series, let's get this project kicked off with some animation. We're going to begin with animating our character. Now, to begin animation, there's a few things that Steve will need to address first. We're going to need to talk about things like, what's our target media? Basically, what will the frames per second be? And in our case, we don't have a target media in mind, so we're going to go with the default 24 frames per second that comes with any standard scene with Houdini when you first do a new scene. From there, we need to discuss our frame range. Even though it's not necessary that we have an established frame range at this time, we'd like to go ahead and get one in. It's very easy to extend or to basically compress the range of frames that we have without doing any damage to the animation that we create. Finally, we'll make sure that real time is set to maintain a true playback speed so that if we were to watch our scene playback, we get as realistic feedback as possible. So with that, let me go ahead and turn this over to Steve.
Great, so let's go and set up our animation options, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit about what we're going to be animating in this video. So let's bring up our animation options, and as Jason mentioned, frames per second I'm going to leave at 24 because we don't have a target media in mind, so I'm just happy to leave it at the default of 24. Also with our real-time behavior, I'm going to leave that set to maintain real-time playback, possibly skipping frames. Now when it comes to our frame range, it's hard to know for sure how many frames we'd want now, but we can get a good estimate because we've got our storyboards and we've got an idea of how long the different actions are going to take to play out. So I'm going to go with a range of 1 through 650 frames for now. We may need to extend or compress this at a later date, but this will serve perfect for what we need right at this moment. So I'm going to click apply, and no, we don't need to stretch anything, and then close out. So now we've got our frames 1 through 650, but you'll notice if we try and scrub the playback, is very slow because of our bleachers. So I am going to hide out our bleachers, allowing us to have very nice scrubbing ability. So what are we going to animate in this video? Well, we're going to start our character animation, but we're not going to animate all of the character's animation. We're simply going to get the character from his starting position to just before the ladder. To do that, he's going to take a deep breath in and prepare for his performance, and then he's going to take 3 jumps to the ladder as we've seen in the storyboards. So let's begin. Let's grab our character, and if I push enter with the mouse over the viewport, we'll bring up our sliders that are in our character's HUD. I do want to right click on each of these in turn and turn them to persistent. And that means if we were to then grab, say, the move tool, we don't lose these sliders. So we still have control over our squash and stretch, our bend, and our special rotate, as well as being able to control the movement. Now, it's also worth noting that the first 220 frames of our animation are going to be a crowd shot with our audience all excited and they're jumping up and down and the camera's going to pan across the stadium. From frame 220 onwards is going to be the main character's animation. So I'm going to set our start the frame for the range that we're actually dealing with in our play bar to go from 220 onwards so that we're only dealing with our character's animation and we're ignoring for now the audience animation at the start of the project. So at frame 220 I want the ball to breathe in and then breathe out, and to breathe in we're going to use squash and stretch to stretch up, and then we're also going to use bend to bend the character backwards as if he was breathing up and leaning backwards. So let's start in our default location, and I'm going to key the bend, so let's alt left click on bend and alt left click on squash and stretch. I'm also going to turn on auto key so that if on any other frames we now change these values, we're automatically going to get keyframes created. So we're going to start out with no bend and no stretch, and after a few frames, let's say something around to frame 245 or so, we're going to breathe in. So we're going to stretch up, and we can use either our slider here or the slider over here. So we're going to stretch up as if we're breathing in, and I'm going to cause him to lean back slightly. Now you'll notice that we've got keyframes created because we had auto key turned on. So now if we scrub, our character breathes in. From this point he's then going to breathe out, exhaling right down to squashing down, ready to start that very first jump. So I'm going to take this up to, say, frame 259, and then let's squash down and also zero out our bend. So our character's going to breathe in and then squash down, ready to start that first jump. from there, the character's going to need to do 3 jumps, and getting a rough feeling for timing, that'd probably take us up to around frame 300 or so. So I'm going to scrub to frame 300. Well, actually, we need to do set our translations, otherwise everything's going to jump there anyway. So let's move back to, if we scope this, right-click, channels expression scope. That's going to give us the keyframes for that parameter down in our play bar, and then I can click on the move to the previous keyframe. That's going to give us frame 259. I'm going to alt left click on our translations to set a key on those. So at frame 259, he's ready to begin his jumps. And then at frame 300 or so, he's going to be about here, ready to jump up onto the ladder. So I'm going to change our frame to around 305, 306. And I'm going to move the character over an X to just about in front of the ladder, so that with one jump he could reach the ladder. And that's going to give us just sliding across the floor. The great thing is we now have the ability to come in and say, okay, well, every third of this we want to have a jump take place. So I'm going to scope our translation channels. So I'm going to bring up and scope our translations. That's going to give us our keyframes for our translate in our play bar. Let's also shrink down so we can see these nice and big, because since we're only dealing with this range to begin with. So here's our start key. We know that on our end key we also want our translate Y to be at the current value, so I'm going to alt left click translate Y to create a key. And also, since we were going to do 3 jumps, around a third and 2/3 in between our start and end, I'm also going to key translate Y at this value. So let's key translate Y with alt left click, and then around here key translate Y with alt left click. In between these are going to be the peaks of the jumps, so we can grab our talented ball and we can move him up in Y just a little bit, and that's going to create a key for the peak of the jump. So if we do that in between all 3 of our jumps, we're going to get the 3 jumps. Now you are going to notice that the motion right now is very wishy-washy. There's no real impact to it. Floaty is a very good term. He's kind of just, hovering up, hovering down, hovering up, hovering down. He's not jumping. We can very easily change this if we were to bring up and scope our translate Y parameter and deal with the animation curve. So let's right click on translate Y, come down to channels and keyframes, and come up to scope channels. I'm then going to push H to home up on our animation curve. And the reason it's floaty is you can see our tangents, our curve is nice and smooth going into and out of every keyframe. To get the impact, to get the jump that we really want, we want to instantly leave the floor because we've just pushed off of the floor. Move up, slow down under gravity, then accelerate again down towards the floor until the point where we impact the floor, and then have an instant change in direction. So instead of decelerating as if we're seeing the floor and we're slowing down to see the floor, we're not going to slow down until we hit the floor, where we're going to instantly change direction and accelerate away from the floor, then slow down under gravity and repeat. So how are we going to do that? Well, we can take our tangents for all of our bottom keyframes, and we can basically untie the tangent handles so we can deal with each the in tangent and the out tangent separately. To do that, I'm going to click on the untie tangent handles icon on the right hand side of our channel editor, and now we have the ability to come in and left click drag on our tangent handles to give us the tangents that allow us to accelerate, instantly change directions. If we do that on all of our keyframes where the talented ball is impacting the ground, it's also, if we were to left click and drag on our top tangents, we can deal with creating more of a natural deceleration under gravity and then acceleration, as opposed to having this sort of thin peak at the top. And also looking at this, I can see that our final jump is maybe not as great in terms of altitude as our first 2. So let's left click on the square around our keyframe, we can drag that up. And also the timing, this first jump has a lot more than the second 2, so let's grab this keyframe. So if I click on the vertical handle and drag, we can move him back some. And also on this keyframe, and then reposition the central keyframes to smooth things out. So yeah, that's a lot nicer. So if we close our channel editor and now were to turn on real time and play this back, we have a lot more impacts on those bounces, but we still have issues. our ball is squashed for the entirety of the animation. That doesn't really make any sense. So what we're going to do, we're going to have the ball so that it squashes on impact, because if you had a ball, and this is a malleable character, it's something that can squash and stretch, if it hits the floor, that's going to cause it to squash down. But we're then going to have the character have some life so that when it leaves the floor, it's going to push off, it's going to stretch up as if it was propelling itself into that jump. As it goes through the jump, we're going to come back down to having the ball return and restore its original shape, ready to be squashed again as soon as it impacts the floor. So we've already got our first squash. As soon as we leave, we want to stretch up into the jump. So let's grab our squash and stretch up into the jump. As we stretch up into the jump, we don't want to impact and squash down, we don't want to squash down until our next impact. So here's our next impact, so let's squash on that impact. But you see, if we were just to leave those keyframes like that, we're going to have our ball almost scared of the floor and like squashing down before he hits. So what we can do is a frame before that impact, so I'm going to click on the minus button to go back a frame. We can set our squash and stretch to 0, not 5. 0. So a frame before, he's not at all affected by the floor. As soon as we hit the floor, we're going to squash. So we get leaving the jump, we're stretched into the jump, return to our normal shape, and then we impact the floor. So let's repeat that for the other two jumps. So let's come into the start of the second jump. We can grab our squash and stretch him out some. Then find the impact of the next jump and squash him down. Jump back a frame and set this to 0. And then let's repeat for our final jump. So as we start to leave the floor, we're going to stretch up into the jump. When we impact on the next jump, we're going to be squashed. Oh, let's grab our character back. So we're going to be squashed. And then a frame before that, we're going to have 0 squash and stretch. So now if we play back, our animation has a little bit more life. The ball looks as if he's pushing off of the floor into each of those jumps. But there's more that we can do. We've got this bend parameter, and it's currently not doing anything other than when we're breathing in at the start of our animation. So what we can do is into the jump, we can bend forwards as if we're pushing our way into the jump. And then after the jump, we can bend back as if to counter that. So as we're going into the jump, we can take our bend and we can push into the jump forward slightly. As we pass through the peak of the jump, we can return and bend backwards slightly. And as we come to the impact of the jump, we can set our bend to 0. So as we're coming into the jump, we're going to bend forward slightly. As we go through the peak of the jump, we're going to start to bend backwards. On the impact, we're going to be 0. And then once again, going into the jump, let's bend forward slightly. Going through the peak of the jump, we can bend backwards slightly. And then on the final impact, we can 0 out. So if we were to watch the entire thing back, bearing in mind that our camera angle for this section of the animation is going to be around something around here. You see we breathe in and then we prepare for our jumps. And then our talented ball is very happily jumping towards our ladder, ready to ascend to what is eventually going to be his ultimate doom. But with that, that's everything that I wanted to cover in terms of starting off our character animation and getting our character from its start position ready to start ascending the ladder.
Okay, and with that, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks a lot.